This is a commentary video about war crimes. It's an ugly subject, especially for my first commentary video. If you clicked on the video to see some gruesome pictures of victims, I show no such pictures. The purpose of war is to kill or capture as many of the enemy as possible until the enemy surrenders. Many will bitterly disagree with much of what I will say in this video because they suppose that war can be made nice. War can never be made nice. First, what is a war crime? In general, a war crime is killing, stealing, and human abuse by a military for reasons other than advancing their position to win the war. Such other reasons might be racism, revenge, or greed, among others. If the reason flies in the face of common sense or understanding of what the real outcome will be, that's also a war crime. A military may decide, for example, to bomb a town for reasons they think are valid, but in fact defy common sense or knowledge of how war works. That's a war crime. Yes, stupidity by those in charge of an army can also be a war crime. Bombing of cities in the Second World War was done in sincere belief that such bombing would crush the enemy's will to fight. In fact, the bombings had the opposite effect, but that wasn't yet realized during World War II. Therefore, they were not war crimes. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan had a different motive. In that case, the Japanese government had struggled for a way to surrender, but also save face. The bombings gave the Japanese government a face-saving reason to surrender. Japan surrendered a few days after the second bombing. The atom bomb attacks were not war crimes. To be fair to both sides, let me point out that the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was also not a war crime. The Japanese made a desperate maneuver to regain access to the oil, steel, and other supplies that America had shut off. The surprise part of the bombing may be considered very unfair. We need to remember that our enemies aren't expected to be fair. That's a part of war. The U.S. was supposed to be carefully watching for surprise attacks, especially after shutting off another nation's access to vital supplies. The best parts of war are absolutely awful. Just because something in war is a great tragedy doesn't make it a war crime. In ancient times, there were, of course, no rules or laws of war. The 2 sides of a war met in battle and fought until one side was mostly killed or wounded. The winning side would kill the wounded enemy soldiers, then take slaves. Many, if not most, of the enemy's women would be raped. Nobody thought any rules were being broken. By the 19th century, a few general rules of war were accepted by American and most European militaries. In 1863, during the American Civil War, the Northern Americans created the Lieber Code, a war rules document for the Northern Army with 186 articles. I've read the code. By 19th century standards, it was written mostly in legalese. I don't think regular soldiers read it. There is one article in almost plain language, Article 47. It reads, crimes punishable by all penal codes such as arson, murder, maiming, assaults, highway robbery, theft, burglary, fraud, forgery, and rape, if committed by an American soldier in a hostile country against its inhabitants, are not only punishable as at home, but in all cases in which death is not inflicted, the severer punishment shall be preferred. Not long after the Lieber Code was released, Northern General W.T. Sherman ordered his troops to march through Georgia and the Carolina states. He did not arrange for any shipments of food or anything else to be sent to his troops. He had his soldiers steal what supplies of food and other things they needed. What happened to Article 47? Was the general allowed to steal food and other goods from people in the North? The Lieber Code was ignored. Let me say that the second worst war crime of America's Civil War was the South's POW camp at Andersonville, Georgia. Captured Northern soldiers there lived in conditions that make the Nazi concentration camps look good. I'll get to the worst war crime later. Over the years, there have been several Geneva Conventions producing documents with what were thought to be complete rules of war. The Geneva Conventions have made war a little less brutal, but in fact militaries either find ways to get around them or simply ignore them. There were 8 documents in the 1949 Convention containing 559 articles. I guess lawyers enjoyed them. There were very publicized war crimes trials after the Second World War. The most publicized were in Nuremberg and in Tokyo. I suppose they did some good, but there's not much evidence of it. America's involvement in the Vietnam War started little more than a decade after those trials. In Vietnam, America bombed villages, sometimes with napalm. America hadn't learned much from the failure of city bombing in Germany and Japan to kill the enemy's will to fight. The worst war crime that occurs is starting a war when common sense and knowledgeable guidance would say that the war will not be won. In World War II, the Japanese thought God was on their side. After all, they had a divine emperor. It didn't occur to them to hold off fighting until they had a dependable source of oil and other things. Hitler should have cozied up to Stalin and built a good two-way trade association. Instead, he supposed he could fight off both Europe and America to his west and Russia to his east. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt didn't call for a declaration of war against Germany. Germany and Japan had a mutual defense treaty, but that did not go into effect unless America attacked Japan. Nevertheless, Hitler declared war on America. This brings me to the worst war crime of the American Civil War. When the war started, the northern states had far more industrial capacity, money, and population than the South. The economy of the South was largely based on selling cotton to Europe. The North, of course, blocked access to the southern ports when the war started. Even worse, the South had a much poorer railroad system than the North. The difference in rail systems meant that the South could not maneuver supplies and troops like the North did. The South didn't have a chance. Its leaders should have known it. The causes of war crimes include government and news media coverage. This is an example of two wartime propaganda posters from the American government to its people during the World War II. Government tends to propagate the idea that the enemy is immoral or otherwise not fit humans. The other side is usually warmongers and/or have committed war crimes. War is often described as keeping the other side from committing atrocities. The poster on the right was inspired by the Bataan Death March. News media usually are pleased to support this view of the enemy with reports of what bad things the enemy did. The military intentionally stirs up hatred for the enemy and its soldiers. It trains soldiers to be aggressive in combat. The opening scene of the movie Patton has General Patton addressing his troops. He tells them to be aggressive and kill as many enemy soldiers as possible. Then he tells them why they won't chicken out of combat.
We're not just going to shoot the bastards. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel. Wade into them. Spill their blood. Shoot them in the belly. When you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do.
That last part explains why seasoned soldiers commit the most war crimes. They've seen too many comrades torn apart. Hating the enemy is a part of war. In a major war, a country won't likely win without it. The military and news media worsen the problem by hiding the atrocities of their own side and highlighting the crimes of the other side. What can we do about war crimes? The answer is not very much. Atrocities in war have been a part of war since ancient times. I think all armies recognize this will happen because of the circumstances that soldiers work under. We can do little to reduce war crimes. Military commanders know about the Geneva Convention, Nuremberg trials, and their country's own rules on the subject. They work behind the lines and don't have to see their friends getting killed. They don't often order war crimes except those they order out of stupidity. I am glad we have had the Geneva Conventions and war crimes trials. It prevents some of the worst crimes, those ordered by the Army's high command. War crimes will be with us as long as there are wars. I see no way to eliminate them. As I said at the start, it's an ugly subject.